Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the Halftime Talk feature interview series. I'm delighted today to be joined by our very own Christof, Rühl, Senior Research Scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy, Columbia University. Christof, we have you on to do the month in review and the month ahead often. I obviously would like to look at spending the next half an hour talking to you about what's happening and what's happened the last 3 days. We can refer to the past month, but really, of course, we're going to focus on the current events here in the Gulf where I sit. I'm going to start by asking you a question that was the headline of our own energy markets briefing note, Gulf Intelligence this morning, which is, are energy markets underpricing today the Gulf disruption that we've seen so far, in your opinion?
I don't think so. I don't think so. We have to distinguish sort of in two dimensions. One is what kind of energy markets we're talking about, and there it's mostly oil versus gas. The other is whether we're just talking about short-term price risks and price spikes, or whether we talk about a serious disruption, which would be longer term, less volume supplied. And on that one, we just don't know. When we step back a little bit and you look at the preparedness of different regions, then when you also ask about which markets you mean, then in the case of oil, it's pretty clear, we had these discussions here for a long time, that the market was, I would say, oversupplied. Nobody would say there was excess demand. So even the opinions may vary to what an extent it was a very loose market. Also, we know that there's, we don't know how many, but we know that there's literally millions of barrels disappearing in strategic storage facilities in China, the biggest sort of oil importer which we have on the planet. Of course, everybody knows about the shift in energy, which made probably also this war possible, which is the shale revolution in the US, which makes the US relatively isolated from these kind of potential disruptions. And we know about the strategic petroleum reserves and in Europe and the US and in the Western Hemisphere, plus ultimately the last defense line or an additional defense line, all this oil at sea, which comes out of Russia, which after Russia has been cut off from India, is looking for a home. So we have sort of a big amount of buffers there, multiple layers of buffers, I would call it, in oil markets. And when you look at the actual disruption risk, we have the Strait of Hormuz, and you read the newspapers, it tells you 1/5 of global oil goes through the Strait of Hormuz, but that's only half true. Because yes, there's about 19 million crude plus liquids, so not just crude coming through the Strait of Hormuz, but there are also pipelines. There's the East-West pipeline out of Saudi Arabia. There is a pipeline from Fujairah in the UAE and several smaller ones. So around about 8 million, so can be brought out over land. That diminishes it. Then secondly, there is storage in the GCC countries, about 350 million, which would indicate that even if exports were completely stopped, even if we didn't have these land pipelines, there's about a month's time to fill storage while production is still running. So if you're just talking about blocking the street, production could continue and the oil could get in storage. And the global flexibility is enough to buffer that. So the nightmare scenario would be a real physical disruption on production sites, but that is very hard to see how that should materialize. So I think oil markets are going to be fine, notwithstanding the potential for price spikes. And it's a similar story in gas.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so they'll be fine for now. As you said, the duration is a big word, isn't it? You just said about a month's buffer. And then, of course, you've got all the stock storage, not only in the Gulf, but China has obviously been storing up as well. But it doesn't remove the nervousness and concern of what could happen if this indeed does, last more than a month. As you said, so far, it's the logistics that we've been seeing that have been mostly impacted. Obviously, freight rates, obviously, there's nothing going through the Strait of Hormuz. Freight rates are skyrocketing. Oil prices aren't skyrocketing to the same extent. And there hasn't been any disruption or damage to actual sort of energy infrastructure. Although we saw the Ras Tanura refinery in Saudi take some kind of shrapnel hit. There's some news out at the moment, I don't know if it's accurate, that Fujairah, the desalination plant, that's not energy, but it's certainly very important for water and security, etc., in the Gulf, in this country, in the UAE. So, I mean, this is a dynamic situation. But what you're saying is what explains the $80 and not $100 oil price so far is plenty of supply.
Yes, and don't forget, I was trying to explicitly talk about the nightmare scenario, physical shortages, right? So that seems to be very far away at the moment still.
Okay.
That doesn't affect the potential for price spikes, and it doesn't affect the fact that price spikes may have caused damage to the economy in various places to different degrees. And what we have, of course, is exactly a situation which is unpredictable, and it's this kind of uncertainty which can lead to price effects and which is poison for orderly market conduct. What we are seeing, I think, militarily speaking, is Iran implementing a game plan which was devised before the war started, which was devised with the intent or with the knowledge that they may become decapitalized in a real sense, that the upper echelons of the government may be gone, which is exactly what happened, and which seems to have delegated responsibility to decentralized military leaders, Revolutionary Guard leaders. And whether it's by design or whether it's just that under the sheer force of these attacks, the structures are splintered, you cannot rule out either rogue elements just trying to set fire on the horizon and go out in a Wagnerian style, or deliberately needling their enemies and hoping that this may relieve some pressure on Iran. Whatever the case is, this element will be with us for a long time, even after maybe official hostilities have ceased. And that gives potential for price spikes. What we have against that are buffers. And ironically, in a sense, these buffers are now mostly with consuming countries and therefore limited. It's no longer spare capacity among the oil-producing countries of the Gulf, which provides the main protection.
That's more important at the moment, isn't it? As long as those consumers have buffers and the logistics and transport is not an issue, at least for the time being. You mentioned the economy. Let's talk about the global economy, Christof. Just if you give us a sort of big picture scenario from your point of view. I mean, you know, as you said, we could see price spikes. We certainly saw, when we talk about gas, we've seen that spike more than oil. And we had the developments in Qatar, LNG, for example, in the last 2 days. But I mean, how extensive do you think the global economy GDP forecast for the year ahead will be hit as things stand by these energy sort of dynamics that we're seeing? We saw forecasts looking pretty healthy for the US. Europe was looking okay for the year ahead. Obviously, we won't even talk about the Gulf economies. They're obviously very nervous right now. But again, sort of a global economic outlook, you know, we're at war at the end of the day. There's a war in the Gulf.
So again, if we limit it to price spikes by definition temporary or just a little bit elevated price levels, the global economy is in decent enough shape to withstand this. There's two elements. One is global economy is still strong. Growth is decent. US is in a good place. Europe is, if anything, picking up. China is very well insulated against these kind of energy shocks, as we discussed. And what is most vulnerable are probably places like India, because they depend on oil and on natural gas. And in particular, places in Southeast Asia like Bangladesh and Pakistan, who are completely LNG dependent. Where we also see vulnerabilities, of course, is in these island economies with a high industrial base, which needs a lot of electricity, and also LNG-based Japan and South Korea, which in turn links back to the energy needs for AI. When you think of South Korea,
how are they going to fare?
But the economy is in decent shape, and I think it is also the other side of that oil prices historically are not high. You know, if you deduct inflation, if you deduct efficiency improvements, and if you just go back a few years and compare it to the situation in 22 when Russia attacked the Ukraine, it's really not a problem. The problem is the uncertainty, and the problem is the longer-term impact on inflation and things like that. For we have a dual picture. We have an economy in decent shape, and we have financial markets in excellent shape. So to speak.
Well, what's going to happen there? I mean, the stock
not exactly
markets
matched to the economy.
The stock markets have taken a little bit of a hit, but not the usual reaction that would happen if they woke up to, you know, there is war in the Middle East yesterday and today even. Would you think that's going to stabilize, or could we see, you know, a 10 to 20% drop in the next month if things remain as is? We don't have a resolution to this conflict.
The stock market has already taken, I would call this a substantial hit compared to what we have seen the last year or so. And the risk is, of course, because of that mismatch, that the stock market is a bit ahead of the economy in terms of optimism, and everybody knows it, everybody talks it. Again, the role of expectations here. I would expect that the dangers on the financial side are high, especially when you compare it with a situation where already some people expected an higher bubble. Other people were worried about private equity. Everybody was already looking around the corner where things might go wrong. And what we are seeing so far is a pretty orderly reaction. We see increases in some stock defense related, and we see increases
well,
in
certain
among oil
stocks,
producers
obviously.
and refiners, and so those who can increase their margins on the back of higher prices and scarce commodities. And we see a big hit to these island economies like Korea and to energy-intensive businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you said, well, you're talking about the more vulnerable consumers versus others. What about who's the most vulnerable producer at the moment? I mean, if we're looking at the Gulf here, GCC producers, Kuwait, Saudi, obviously the UAE, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of getting their oil out, Saudi has options, the UAE has options, Kuwait doesn't. If you're thinking about just the Gulf as an outlet there. How would you compare one against the other in terms of a prolonged conflict here? And of course, there's the economic impact on their economies, isn't there?
Again, there's two different things.
Sentiment.
So the GCC, if you take the GCC as an island, as an isolated group, in terms of, they all, of course, dependent on oil revenues at the end of the day. But again, their reserves, in particular, their financial reserves and resilience in that respect, is large enough to withstand that. The danger here is the long-term damage to the non-oil sector of the economy. In particular, just now, as we both know, living there, is that it has become a real destination of choice for big money, and in order to resettle there. And all of a sudden, you see, hotels burning, and that is, of course, a long-term damage.
First time in my 26 years here, there's been anything like this.
And this is, yeah, but I bet you, like everybody else, when you first came, you were slightly worried that you're moving to a region where something like this might happen. And just now, when the rest of the world seems to have been convinced that it will not happen to the extent that they were willing to park serious money there, it does happen. And this is, of course, intended, I think, by those who perpetrate those acts. How damaging, again, we don't know, because we don't know how long it will last. But the effect from oil revenues per se and gas revenues per se is, I think, manageable, limited, and constrained in terms of time. I wouldn't worry about that too much. The biggest winner among producing countries, of course, are those not in the EU, in the GCC, and among all of them, the biggest winner, certainly for the time being, is Russia. And I'm just talking about
the
revenue.
US.
Just talking about, come to the US in a second, about revenue for the moment, not politically, because Putin is losing friends at a rapid clip. But in terms of revenues and in terms of finding outlets for their floating storage after India has been cut off, that's an opportunity which they will use, and I think which may lead to exports to India being resumed, which is one of the big losers. The US is, on the face of it, is a winner. Again, just looking at the economics, not on the military and political side, because they are, an oil and a natural gas exporter. So they benefit to some extent from higher prices. But the US is also in a situation where the oil prices, and in particular the end user prices in the gas stations, are not independent from global markets. So they go up, and they have elections coming up. Trump has, that's one vulnerability. And the US are in a situation where higher oil prices will still feeding through into higher rates of inflation. And that's another vulnerability after all this ruckus of replacing the current Federal Reserve chair with somebody more to Trump's liking, who has based his case for lower interest rates exclusively on productivity advancements, not on events like energy prices going up. And so it's a bit of an uncertainty how the Federal Reserve will react to that should oil prices stay up in a prolonged period of time.
Well, perhaps Donald Trump will decide to end this war if he sees they're going up against his agenda. I mean, let's talk a bit about a week ago, before this actually happened. Of course, the expectation for this conflict has been in the works since the start of the year. That's probably why we saw prices already go up by $8 to $10 anyway. The expectation that this is the build-up of the military in the region, etc., the US military. But let's just talk a bit about, Christof, I'd like to get your thoughts on the tariff situation, because we also had the news in January, or in February rather, that the Supreme Court ruling against Donald Trump's illegal tariffs that he's been sort of trying to impose across the globe, and he reacted by saying 10% across the board, etc. Do you think that this year, 2026, we, of course, our attention now is diverted, but will tariffs settle into a normal rate, do you think? This will the Supreme Court get its way? Will Donald Trump try and defy it? I mean, what's the impact there? And of course, there's the whole, everybody claiming their tariffs back. I mean, it could be a big mess, couldn't it?
Yes, but
From an economic point of view.
all indications are that, number one, the Trump administration is determined enough to see this differential tariff system through, where they could use tariffs as a stick, to hit those who are not obedient in other respects. But they may have lost a little bit of that leverage, but they still want to try to get it back. And all indications are that they will find other legal means in the US to impose a tariff system which is substantially different from the negotiated global tariffs we had under WTO arrangements, World Trade Organization arrangements. And this, I think, is something which is very important. If we step back now and ask ourselves what has changed and what is going to be likely to be a lasting change, other than this figure called Trump becoming president and 4 years from now, or 3 years from now, probably no longer being president. There are really two big trends, I think, here. The first one happened a few years ago and is coming from energy. It is the shale revolution. It is what many of us have predicted 10, 15 years ago. We said, if that happens, the geopolitical situation will radically change, and at the core of this change will be a different relationship between the US and the Middle East, the Gulf, essentially. That has happened and is
That's
playing
obviously
itself
being
out.
demonstrated, absolutely.
And the second long-term development on the back of that, and enforced and pushed for by the Trump administration, really is this worldview that globalization is evil, and that we are dealing with a world which has sort of hegemonial leaders, this world of blocks. There's basically the US and the Western Hemisphere. It's kind of strange. They don't see themselves as being in control of the whole world. Theirs is the Western Hemisphere. There's China and Asia. There's even Russia and the Ukraine plus X. And what we are seeing, both from the tariff side and also now from the impacts of this war, is that these building blocks are what really matters, and how difficult it has become for what Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, has called the middle countries, to keep up and to survive and to thrive in this kind of environment. Europe is sort of the odd man out, because there could be a hegemonial power, but they're so splintered that there are a bunch of middle countries at the economies at the other side. But if you look at the globe, we really have a few big players left standing here, and those in their shadows. And it will be very hard for those in their shadows over the next few years or so to have a voice comparable to what they had under the system of globalization, which we had since roughly the early 2000s.
Yeah, and I mean, the other aspect of the big powers, of course, the US being the largest is, from a war point of view, again, I was listening to a couple of podcasts yesterday, the difference between now and, for example, the Iraq war, people are comparing the scenario. Could it be in Libya? Could it be in Iraq, in Iran, etc.? And there's a very big difference, isn't there? Because we're not going to see boots on the ground by the US, and because of technology, they're being able to achieve much more than they could before. If you had your crystal ball out here, Christof, how long do you see that we could possibly see this being resolved between Iran and the US and Israel, and how soon, if so? What's the most likely scenario? Everybody's asking, what is the end game from a US-Israel perspective, or from the US perspective?
Nobody with a straight face can give you an answer on that, because we genuinely do not know. But there's a few points worth making. Just as a footnote to start with, boots on the ground, he has not ruled this out in the last time Trump was asked. I would again step back. So the narrow situation around Iran, Israel, the US will be resolved one way or another, most likely with a very impoverished regime in Iran and 10, 20 more years of misery for its people if they don't seize the opportunity. And that's much, much easier said from the chair in Washington or London or even Dubai than from the streets of Tehran or any other cities. So that will be resolved. There will be relatively calm. There will be a wave of secondary nasty terror effects That would be my take on it. Much more important, the difference to Iraq for me is not necessarily boots on the ground or not, because if Trump goes on like that, then the Iran war will not have been his last war. And I think the really important part here is again two. One, the most important difference to Iraq was this is not a coalition here. This is just the US and a junior partner.
Yeah.
And there was no attempt at coalition building at all. Again, this is this view of the world as ruled by a few hegemonial powers, and all the rest
But
has
the
to fall
intention
into
with
place or
Iraq,
gets
the
into trouble.
intention at the time of Iraq was the oil, wasn't it? It was the oil security.
It was also the whole situation. It was an attempt at building a broad-based coalition in order to get support in the UN, in order to get support in international organizations, in order to get later help with the re-establishing the economy in these countries from the WTO, this was within a, call it rules-based system, however flawed the rules might have been, but within a global institution, network of institutions which were respected, and at least on the face of it, to which you had to pay lip service. Now what happens is completely different. This is one country, 1.5 countries doing it on their own, and the rest be damned. And you can see the reaction of the strongmen. You don't even need to go to the Democrats, how they are silent from Xi to Putin. That's the language they understand. And it's not clear that's the world they wanted, but this is,
well, I mean,
those who
you
saw
mentioned,
wind will earn storm.
You mentioned Xi. I mean, they have been very quiet, haven't they, China, except for calling for, please, let's find a peaceful solution as soon as possible. I mean, does China feel vulnerable at all? I mean, it has a lot at stake here, doesn't it?
It probably doesn't feel very vulnerable, but it's certainly worried, and certainly, like everybody else, looking at this new economy, this new web of relations, this new web of acting with a big degree of surprise. And I think to those who are used to act in similar fashion, the surprise is probably even larger than to us who are used to this, moderated and more democratic back and forth. The interesting part, of course, is that in the US, this may all be over in 3-4 years' time if Americans are fed up. And it's Americans who have the power to change things 3 years from now. It's much less Russians or Chinese, and certainly not the Iranians who can easily do that. Okay. But this worldview is I think the major change which we are seeing here, and things will end badly if this current administration continues long enough, or another 4 years, because you can see how somebody who says I don't want wars anywhere starts to like violence and starts to ratchet it up from his isolated attacks on individuals to Venezuela, now to Iran. And so I don't see necessarily that this will stop tomorrow.
Well, I mean, it's incredible that a system like the American government and Congress can't have any control at trying to even balance that approach. I mean, it's really as if you're not looking at the United States of America, but some rogue state with a leader who's doing whatever he wants. Christof, before we let you go, are we going to see $100 oil in the next 2 months?
Well, it's could be easily, but it really would be a
150
spike.
even.
Again, the main worry is will we see sustained disruptions or not. If you see 150 for one day, who cares? I mean, people will make and lose money, but that's not what is a real sort of global economic shock is about. Oil markets oil prices are relatively low, and of course we may see spikes. That's a function of the unpredictable. But you have to see through that if you really want to go for either the economic impact or the energy market impact. The thing to worry about is what you mentioned earlier. If the American electorate and the Congress and their institutions don't stop that, then this will not have been the last war of its kind. And and we will at some point see boots on the ground someplace. And that's the worrisome part here, I think. Also, from the point of view of the financial system and the economy.
Lots of things to worry about. Christof Rühl, Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Thanks so much for joining us today on Halftime Talk. It's been great to get your perspective.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure is all mine.